My name is Evelise Carver. I am 34 years old. And the afternoon my brother cornered me in a hospital hallway and told me that paying for our mother's care fell to me because I earned the most was the afternoon I understood that being trusted with responsibility and being respected for it are two entirely different things. He said it without lowering his voice. You make the most. It falls to you. My mother was 12 feet away, on the other side of a half-open door, and he said it in the tone people use when they are stating a policy, not asking a question. My father was beside him, arms crossed, and he added, "Don't be small about this, Evelise." As though the concern were my character, not the content of what they were asking. I looked at my brother. I looked at my father. I said, "I understand completely," and I meant it in more ways than they knew. Then I stepped around them, walked to the end of the hallway, and took out my phone. The call was to a woman named Patricia Delwood, who was my mother's estate and healthcare attorney and had been for 4 years. I told her that the family situation had clarified and that I wanted to review the scope of the documents we had filed. She said she had time Thursday. I said Thursday worked. What my brother and my father did not know, standing in that hallway outside my mother's room, was that I had held her durable financial power of attorney and her healthcare proxy for 3 years. Every account with her name on it. Every medical decision that required a signature. Every authorization the facility called about at 11 at night. All of it had been running through me, quietly, since the spring she was first diagnosed, when my brother was in the middle of relocating his family to a different state, and my father had said, with genuine helplessness rather than malice, that he didn't know how to manage the paperwork. I had managed the paperwork. I had managed everything. And on a Tuesday morning 6 days after that hospital hallway, my brother discovered what managing everything actually meant when the bank called him to say that the account he had attempted to access required authorization from the named agent, and the named agent was not him. I want to tell you how I got to that hallway because the conversation outside my mother's door was not the first time my family had looked at my life and seen a resource rather than a person. It was simply the first time I had the documentation to show them what they had been looking at. My mother's name is Dolores. She is 63, and she has a progressive neurological condition that was diagnosed 3.5 years ago, when I was 30 and had been working as a contracts administrator at an engineering and infrastructure consulting firm called Bardwell Nichols Group for 4 years. The diagnosis was not a sudden thing. There had been symptoms for at least a year before the neurologist, a specialist named Dr. Mara Osei at the University Medical Center, put a name to them, but the formal diagnosis was the moment the family had to reorganize itself around a new reality. My brother Emilio is 6 years older than me. He had moved his family, his wife Greta and their 2 children, to a city 4 hours away 18 months before the diagnosis, for a regional manager position at a logistics company. The move had been framed, in family conversations, as a temporary sacrifice, an opportunity he had to take, something we would all adjust to. My mother had been proud of him for it. My father, who is 66 and retired from a career in municipal water management, had been proud of him too. I had been the one who remained in the city where my parents lived, not because I lacked options, but because I had found what I was looking for at Bardwell Nichols and had no reason to leave it. After the diagnosis, the distance that had been a temporary sacrifice became a structural fact. Emilio was 4 hours away with a demanding job and 2 children in school. My father, who had managed the household finances for 40 years with a system that involved a paper ledger and a filing cabinet in the spare room, had no framework for medical paperwork, insurance coordination, or care facility agreements. My mother needed someone who could be present and who understood documents. I was present. I understood documents. Those 2 things had defined my role in the family since I was 22, and they redefined it again now. The first year after the diagnosis, my mother was still largely independent. She drove herself to most of her appointments, managed her own medications with a weekly pill organizer, and maintained routines that had structured her life for decades. Her garden, her Thursday lunches with 2 friends from her former workplace, her weekly phone call with her sister in another state. My involvement was primarily administrative. I attended the appointments that required someone to take notes, I managed the insurance claims that required follow-up, and I fielded the calls from the specialist's office when my mother had questions she wanted help translating into plain language. It was during this period that Patricia Delwood entered the picture. My mother had been referred to Patricia by a neighbor whose husband had gone through a similar diagnosis 2 years earlier. Patricia's practice focused on elder law and estate planning, and my mother's first meeting with her was about making sure her affairs were in order, not because anything was imminent, but because the diagnosis had made clear that the window for clear decision-making was finite, and it was better to act inside it than outside it. I drove my mother to that first meeting. I sat in the waiting room while they talked. Afterward, my mother came out and said that Patricia had recommended, among other things, that she execute a durable power of attorney naming someone she trusted to manage her financial affairs if she became unable to do so, and a healthcare proxy naming someone she trusted to make medical decisions. My mother looked at me in the car before she started the engine. She said, "I want it to be you." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Emilio is 4 hours away. Your father doesn't know how to read an insurance statement. You've been the one doing this." I said, "Okay." We went back the following week. I signed the documents as the named agent under both the financial power of attorney and the healthcare proxy. Patricia walked me through what the authority meant, what it didn't mean, what circumstances would activate it, and what my obligations were as agent. I asked the questions I needed to ask. Patricia answered them with the directness of someone who had had this conversation many times and valued people who paid attention. My father knew about the documents. He had been told by my mother that she had done her estate planning and that I was named as her agent. He had nodded and said that was sensible and returned to the crossword he had been doing. I do not think he understood, in any specific way, what the documents contained. I do not think he read them. Emilio was told that my mother had done some planning with an attorney. He said that was a good idea. He did not ask what the planning included. He was in the middle of a difficult quarter at work, and his older child had just started middle school, and the logistics of his own life were demanding enough that the details of our mother's documents occupied, I suspect, approximately 45 seconds of his attention before something else required it. I noted this. I did not comment on it. The second year was more demanding than the first. My mother's condition progressed in the way Dr. Osei had predicted it would, not a sudden change, but a steady narrowing of what she could manage independently. She stopped driving in January, which meant that someone needed to take her to appointments. She had increasing difficulty with her medication schedule, which meant that someone needed to set up a system that didn't depend on her remembering. The Thursday lunches with her friends became less frequent, and by spring she had stopped attending them. I arranged for a part-time home care aide through an agency called Suncrest Home Services. The aide, a woman named Rosa, who came 3 mornings a week, helped my mother with the routines that had become difficult: getting dressed, preparing breakfast, managing the medication organizer. The cost was $1,760 a month, which I coordinated from my mother's own account under the financial power of attorney. I did not pay it from my personal funds. My mother had savings and a pension from her 31 years as a school district administrator, and the money was hers to use for her own care. My role was to make the decisions and manage the paperwork, not to subsidize the cost. This is a distinction I want to be precise about because it matters to what came later. I was not paying for my mother's care out of my own pocket. I was managing her care, which is a different kind of contribution, and in some ways a more demanding one, because it required not money but time and attention, and the willingness to be the person the phone rang for at 11 at night. My brother called on the major holidays and my mother's birthday. My father came to dinner on Sundays and helped with the garden when his back permitted. Neither of them attended a medical appointment, managed an insurance claim, or received a call from a facility after business hours. Neither of them asked whether they should. I did not tell them what I was doing in specific terms. I answered their questions when they asked, which was infrequently, and otherwise managed the situation the way I managed projects at Bardwell Nichols, methodically, with documentation, without waiting for someone else to notice what needed to be done. At Bardwell Nichols, I had been promoted to senior contracts administrator 2 years after joining, and the year my mother was diagnosed, I had taken on the role of contracts team lead, supervising a group of 3 junior administrators and managing the contract lifecycle for the firm's largest infrastructure project, a water treatment facility expansion with a total contract value of $4.3 million. My manager, a methodical man named Gerald Pratt, had told me at my annual review that I was the most reliable person on his team, and that reliability, in his experience, was rarer than any credential. I kept those two things, my mother's situation and my professional life, in separate compartments, not because I was hiding one from the other, but because that was how I had always worked. I did not discuss my personal life at the office. I did not discuss my professional competence with my family. Each domain had its own structure, and I maintained both with the same attention. The third year, the care needs increased again. Dr. Osei's assessment in the spring indicated that my mother had reached the point where full-time home care or a transition to a memory care facility would be the appropriate next step. She reviewed the options with me over 2 appointments, walking through the differences in care models, costs, and what each would mean for my mother's daily life. I took notes at both appointments. I brought the notes home, reviewed them against the financials in my mother's accounts, and spent 2 weekends researching facilities and in-home care agencies before scheduling tours of 3 memory care facilities and a follow-up conversation with Patricia Delwood about the financial implications of each option. My mother, at that point, was still able to participate in decisions about her own care, and I made certain she did. I brought her to one of the facility tours. I described the others to her in terms I knew she would find useful. She made her preference clear. She wanted to remain at home for as long as it was feasible, and I structured the care plan around that preference, contracting with Suncrest for expanded hours and arranging for a physical therapist to come twice a week. In the fall, she had a health event that required hospitalization. She was in the hospital for 9 days. Emilio drove down on the 3rd day. My father came to the hospital every afternoon. I was there every morning before work and every evening after, and I was the person the nursing staff called when a decision was needed outside of visiting hours, because my name was on the healthcare proxy and my number was in the file. It was on the 6th day, in the late afternoon, that Emilio pulled me into the hallway. He had been there for 4 days by then. He had spoken to the nurses. He had spoken to the attending physician, a hospitalist named Dr. Kenji Watanabe, who had answered his questions patiently, and then, on the second question that required authorization, had said that he would need to confirm the decision with the patient's named healthcare agent. Dr. Watanabe had said my name. Emilio had looked at him, then looked at me, and not said anything in the moment. He said it in the hallway on the 6th day. "You make the most. It falls to you." He had, I understood, been working up to this for at least a day. He had a figure in mind. He named it outside my mother's door, a monthly contribution of $3,200, which was roughly what he had calculated the ongoing care would cost above what my mother's pension covered. He had decided, without discussion, that this gap was mine to fill because my salary was higher than his. He had decided this the way he had decided many things in his life, by identifying the path of least resistance and naming it as fairness. My father added, "Don't be small about this," which was his version of settling the matter. I told them I understood completely. I stepped outside and called Patricia Delwood. I want to be clear about what the call to Patricia was and was not. It was not a revenge call. I did not call her to do something to my brother. I called her because the conversation in the hallway had made clear that my family had been operating under a set of assumptions about who controlled what, and that those assumptions were incorrect, and that the most useful thing I could do for my mother, for the situation, for everyone, was to make sure the actual structure was understood. Patricia and I spoke for 22 minutes. I told her what had happened. She asked several specific questions about what my brother had said, and what my father had said, and what, if anything, my mother had been told. I answered each question directly. At the end of the call, she said, "You don't need to do anything tonight. Come Thursday, and we'll review what you want to communicate and to whom." I said I would be there Thursday. I went back inside and sat with my mother until visiting hours ended. My mother was discharged on day 9. I arranged her return home, coordinated with Suncrest to expand coverage to 6 days a week, and scheduled a follow-up appointment with Dr. Osei for the following month. On Tuesday morning, 3 days after the discharge, my brother called the bank. He had been on the account, my mother's primary checking account, as an authorized user since my father had added him years earlier, in a period before my mother's diagnosis, when the account had been used occasionally for family expenses and Emilio had needed access for a specific transaction that I no longer remembered the details of. He had retained that authorized user status for years and used the way people retain things they don't need until they decide they do. He called the bank to discuss the account balance and what he described as coordinating care expenses. The bank representative told him that the account had a named agent under a durable power of attorney and that any changes to the account structure or significant transactions required authorization from that agent. The representative said my name. Emilio called me 40 minutes later. The call was short and then long. The short part was him asking if I had a power of attorney over our mother's finances. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then the call became the long part. He said, "When did that happen?" I said, 3 years ago. Patricia Delwood drafted it. Mom signed it at her office. I was named as agent. He said, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I said, "Dad was told." Mom told him. I assumed he had mentioned it. He said, "Dad didn't tell me." I said, "I understand. That's a conversation to have with Dad." He said, "So you've been controlling her accounts for 3 years." I said, "Managing them." Under her direction, while she was able to give direction. More independently, as that became necessary. Everything has been documented, and I'm prepared to account for every transaction. He said, "I didn't know any of this." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm her son." I said, "Yes. And I'm her daughter, and I'm her named agent, and for 3 years I have been the person who handled the things that needed to be handled. I want to talk about all of this, but I'd like to do it properly. Can you come Saturday?" He said after a pause, "Yes." He came Saturday. He brought Greta, which I had not expected but did not object to. My father was there as well. I had set up the dining room table with 4 chairs and a folder in the center. The folder contained a copy of the financial power of attorney, a copy of the healthcare proxy, a 12-page account summary I had prepared covering every transaction I had made on my mother's behalf over 3 years, organized by date, category, and amount, and a 1-page care plan summary showing the current arrangement, the monthly costs, and what my mother's pension and savings would cover through the projected care horizon. I placed it on the table and sat down. My father picked up the power of attorney first. He read the first page slowly. His reading glasses were on, and he held the paper at the slight angle he always used when he was concentrating. He turned to the second page. Emilio picked up the account summary. He went to the last page first, where the totals were, and then went back to the beginning and read forward. His wife Greta sat with her hands in her lap, not reaching for anything. No one spoke for several minutes. My father set down the power of attorney. He said, "I didn't know it covered the accounts." I said, "The financial POA covers all accounts in her name. The healthcare proxy covers medical decisions. Patricia explained both when we executed them." He said, "I didn't read them." I said, "I know." Emilio set down the account summary. He said, "This is 3 years of transactions." I said, "Yes." He said, "You've been doing all of this." I said, "Yes." He looked at the table. His hand was resting on the edge of the account summary, and he pressed down once, slightly, as though confirming the paper was real. He said, "In the hallway when I said." I said, "I know what you said in the hallway." He said, "I didn't know about any of this." I said, "That's what I'd like to talk about." The conversation lasted 3 hours. I want to be accurate about what it was, because it was not a triumphant scene, and I was not trying to make it one. It was a hard conversation between people who had been operating with different amounts of information, and the amount of information I had been holding, laid out on a table in 12 pages and 2 legal documents, was clarifying in a way that was not comfortable for anyone in the room, including me. My father said, several times in different ways, that he should have been more involved. He said it without excuses, and I accepted it without elaborating because the point was not to establish blame, but to establish, going forward, a structure that was visible to everyone. Emilio said, eventually, that he had not understood the scope of what had been happening. He said he had assumed, and he used the word assumed without flinching from it, which I noted, that things were being managed somehow without examining who was doing the managing or what it required. He said that the comment in the hospital hallway had been about money because that was the only dimension of the situation he had been thinking about, and that he could now see it was not the only dimension. Greta, who had not said anything for the first 2 hours, said quietly that she wanted to understand what support looked like going forward and whether there was something they could do from 4 hours away that would help. It was the most useful question asked all afternoon, and I told her so. We agreed on 3 things before the afternoon was over. First, that I would continue as the named agent, with full authority, and that any family member who had questions about my mother's care or finances could request a quarterly summary from me, the same summary I would be required to produce for Patricia's review in any case. Second, that Emilio would take on one concrete coordination task. He would be the person who researched and evaluated facility options when the time came that home care was no longer sufficient, and he would present his findings to the family before any decision was made. Third, that my father would attend the next appointment with Dr. Osei, so that he heard the medical picture directly from her rather than through my translation of it. These were not dramatic resolutions. They were adjustments. They required no one to apologize in formal terms, and they did not require me to relinquish anything I had built. They required everyone in the room to be honest about what they had and hadn't done, and to make different decisions going forward. I could accept that. The following month, I attended the appointment with Dr. Osei alongside my father. He sat in the chair to my mother's left. I sat to her right, with my notepad. Dr. Osei reviewed my mother's current status, adjusted one medication, and walked my father through the projected trajectory with the careful precision that had made her my mother's primary specialist from the beginning. My father asked 2 questions. Dr. Osei answered both fully. On the way home, my father drove, and my mother sat in the passenger seat, and I sat in the back. My father said at a red light, "She's a very clear doctor." My mother said, "Evilise found her." My father looked in the rear-view mirror. He did not say anything else. But he looked and I noted it, the way I noted most things, quietly, in a place I could return to later. At Bardwell Nichols, Gerald Pratt retired in October and the firm conducted an internal search for the contracts director position. I applied. The interview process took 6 weeks and involved a presentation to the firm's senior partners, a panel I had prepared for with the same thoroughness I applied to everything, a 30-slide deck, a case study built from the water treatment project, a 5-year projection for the contract's function under the new organizational structure. The senior partner who led the panel, a woman named Diane Achterberg, asked me 3 questions after the presentation and said that my documentation was the clearest she had seen in the process. I was offered the position in November. Salary $97,000, plus a performance structure tied to project delivery metrics. I accepted on a Wednesday and called my mother to tell her that evening. She said, "Tell me what the title is." I said, "Contracts Director." She said, "Say it again." I said it again. She said, "Good." The following spring, Emilio sent me a folder of his own. It contained his research on memory care facilities within a 90-minute radius, 7 facilities, each with a 1-page summary he had written covering cost, staff-to-resident ratio, proximity to family, and the outcome of his phone calls with the intake coordinators. He had called each one. He had asked about wait lists. 2 of them had wait lists, and he had noted the estimated wait time. It was thorough work. I told him so when I called to thank him. He said, "I should have been doing something for a while." I said, "You're doing something now." He said, "Is it enough?" I said, "It's a start. Keep going." My mother had not yet needed to transition to a facility. She was comfortable at home, with Rosa and 2 additional aides Suncrest had placed, and with the weekly physical therapy sessions that had become a rhythm she looked forward to. Her Thursday lunches had resumed, once a month, at a restaurant that was easier for her to navigate than the one they had used before. Her garden was smaller than it had been. My father tended most of it now, but she still directed it, telling him where to put things and whether they were right. I came for dinner on Sundays. My father cooked. My mother sat at the table and talked about what she had been watching and what Rosa had said that week, and whether the neighbor's new dog was going to be a problem for the garden. It was ordinary in the way that things become ordinary when they have been tended carefully enough and long enough that the tending becomes invisible. That invisibility no longer bothered me the way it once had, because I understood now what I had not understood 3 years ago, when I signed those documents in Patricia Delwood's office without knowing exactly how many times they would ring at 11 at night. The work is not invisible to the person who does it. It is only invisible to the people who didn't. The record you build in the quiet, before anyone is watching, before anyone thinks to look, is the only one that holds when the room finally does look. For 3 years, I held a financial power of attorney and a healthcare proxy, managed my mother's care, coordinated with her physician and her attorney and her aide, documented every transaction, and answered every call. When my brother told me in a hospital hallway that the cost fell to me because I earned the most, I told him I understood, stepped outside, and called Patricia Delwood. On the following Tuesday, the bank said my name to him, not his. On Saturday, he sat at my dining room table and read 12 pages he had not known existed. What changed in that room was not the authority that had always been mine, but the knowledge of it, finally shared, finally visible. Here is what I have thought about since. When Emilio sat at that table and put his hand on the edge of that account summary, that one quiet press, as if he was confirming the paper was real, I have wondered what number he was seeing behind his eyes. Whether it was the 3 years or the monthly figures or something that didn't have a dollar amount at all. If you have ever been the person in a room who already knew what the documents said while everyone else was reading them for the first time, what did you do with the silence while they caught up? Share this with someone who has been doing the work that no one thought to ask about. And if you recognize yourself in this story, subscribe. There are more of them where this one came from. This is an original fictional story created for entertainment purposes only. All names, characters, events, and financial details are invented and do not represent real individuals or occurrences.